April 16, 2025. A date that nearly changed the course of African history forever. A silent but deadly plot was unfolding. A conspiracy so dangerous, it aimed to assassinate President Ibrahim Traoré and plunge Burkina Faso into chaos. But this wasn't just betrayal from the shadows. It was a coordinated alliance between internal traitors and terrorist networks, ready to attack civilians and the military alike. The plan nearly succeeded, until something remarkable happened. Loyal soldiers within the Burkinabe military refused to sell out their country. They exposed the plot, but the danger didn't end there. Here's where things take a disturbing turn. The mastermind behind the coup. He fled, not into hiding, but into the arms of another African state. Welcomed, not punished. Why would Ivory Coast shelter someone who tried to destroy Burkina Faso from within? Is this just politics, or something much more sinister? And the alleged architect of this plot? Not a rebel, not a foreign agent, but Barry Abdourahmane, a high-ranking officer from within Traoré's own ranks. What's really happening behind the scenes in West Africa? Let's break it down. Consider that. A man who was trusted with the country's safety became its adversary. Barry had access to extremely sensitive, high-level military intelligence. And knowing full well the devastation it could do, he gave it to terrorist leaders rather than safeguarding it. This was no error. It wasn't a slip. It was an intentional treachery. Despite knowing that innocent lives would be lost, he went ahead and did it. For what purpose? Strength? Retaliation? Cash? Barry betrayed the administration in more ways than one. Every Burkinabe who believes in peace, unity, and a future free from anarchy supported by outside forces was betrayed by him. This type of treachery splits countries apart from the inside out. Barry did not, however, act alone. He persuaded people to join his perverse purpose by using his influence. Promises of wealth, power, and high-ranking posts enticed fellow officers in the Burkinabe armed forces, soldiers who had vowed to defend the country. If only they had contributed to Traoré's downfall. To make matters worse, Barry contacted the militia organization VDM. In addition to paying them off, he instilled feelings of betrayal in their thoughts and encouraged them to turn against the nation they were supposed to defend. There was more to it than a coup attempt. The conflict was psychological, and while everyone else was playing checkers, Barry was playing chess. Then he disappeared. As simple as that. Disappeared without a trace. Before Burkina Faso's intelligence bureau made a terrifying discovery, no one knew where he had vanished to for weeks. Ivory Coast was where Barry had escaped to. Intelligence sources say there is still a plan to terminate Traoré and plunge Burkina Faso into complete turmoil. From Abidjan, Ivory Coast, it is being organized. The new objective: to attack prior to June 2025. This goes beyond simple treason. It's a covert conflict. And time is running out. Thus, on April 16th, they failed. However, they simply rescheduled the date rather than resigning. As of right now, the new deadline is before June 2025. It's more than just concerning. It's devastating. We have blamed the West for causing chaos and division in Africa for many years. But what do you do when your own people are the ones wreaking havoc? These inhabitants of Burkina Faso have betrayed all that their nation has to offer. Calm, stability, advancement. They are indifferent. They have closed their eyes to Traoré's metamorphosis, the audacious reforms, the pride in the country, the optimism. Why? Why would any African decide to assist foreigners in destroying what we are at last beginning to construct? Then comes the portion that exacerbates the discomfort. Ivory Coast. Our alleged brother, a neighboring nation, has decided to shield these traitors. Consider that. They have extended the red carpet rather than supporting Burkina Faso and cooperating with our officials to apprehend these criminals. Not even one word of censure, not even a formal declaration, nothing but quiet. The kind of quiet that says 1,000 words. Furthermore, it doesn't end there. These adversaries of the Burkinabe people have been awarded sanctuary, rather than merely a place to stay. A place to continue planning, scheming, and destroying peace. Let's be honest now. Anyone who is paying attention may see why. Ivory Coast president is not operating independently. It's a puppet, held by the same individuals that have interfered in African issues for many years. France. It was not Alassane Ouattara who became the leader. We must remember. In 2011, France fully supported his takeover. Since then, he has fulfilled his role by defending French interests rather than African unity. Thus, it is evident. This goes beyond politics. It's intimate. It is a calculated move. It's also risky. It is currently unclear what Burkina Faso will do. What will Africa do about its own betrayals? More importantly, let's investigate further. There is more to Alassane Ouattara's narrative than politics. It has to do with long-term planning and manipulation that started many years ago, when France stepped in and handpicked a young Ouattara for a position at the International Monetary Fund in 1968. He was only 26 years old. That was the start of a well-thought-out scheme. His ascent was no accident, with France at the center. He moved quickly, and doors opened with ease. Additionally, he was advantageously stationed in Paris when he was named chargé de mission to the Central Bank of West African States in 1973. 2 years later, there was still another promotion. France then made sure he was appointed vice-governor of the BCEO in 1983. The puppet was being put together piece by piece. The game gets more dirtier from here. In the background, France was destroying Ivory Coast's economy while preparing Ouattara for leadership. Yes, the same nation they said they were assisting. Growth was suppressed, policies were twisted, and the economy gradually started to implode. It was precisely timed sabotage, not an accident. Because France revealed its answer when Ivory Coast was in dire straits and drowning in economic disaster. Enter Ouattara, the man they had placed in every major financial institution and had been cultivating for years. He was now portrayed as the man who could save Ivory Coast and as its savior. However, protecting the nation was never the goal. It has to do with control. And that's precisely how Ivorian leadership was influenced by France. Instead, they used economics, manipulation, and a man named Alassane Ouattara, not tanks or coups. France refused to back down as Ivory Coast's economy continued to fall into catastrophe. It intensified. Its intentions regarding Alassane Ouattara also changed. Ouattara went back to the International Monetary Fund with the full backing of France. This time, as the director of the African department, as well as an economist. He was appointed a counselor to the managing director of the IMF at the same time. With a dual function intended to increase his global profile, he was being positioned on the global stage. He returned to the Central Bank of West African States 4 years later, although not as an ordinary officer. He came back as the bank's governor. Naturally, the job was conveniently located in France. Ivory Coast's economy was barely surviving at that point. The damage was already done. Finally, the timing was right for France. Someone had laid the trap. It was necessary for France to install a puppet inside the Ivorian government. That's what they did best. Manipulation that takes place in private. They managed to persuade the nation's aging father, President Ibrahim, to name Ouattara as the leader of the nation's economic stabilization effort in 1990. They presented him as the man who could solve all problems and the economic savior. But there was nothing to be fixed here. It was about establishing legitimacy and presenting Ouattara to the people as a national hero. France was also relying on another element: time. Ibrahim, the president, was dying. In France, he had had surgery for prostate cancer. The French administration was also aware of his deteriorating condition. They were aware that time was running out. They therefore proceeded quickly. Pressure grew behind the scenes, and France had its way by the end of 1990. Weak, ill, and defenseless, President Ibrahim was coerced into making Alassane Ouattara Ivory Coast's prime minister. It was a brilliant move. Now France had a man with both political and economic power. A smiling, suit-wearing puppet, ready to work for Paris, not Abidjan. The French had done it by then. They had accomplished their long-term goal. They had effectively placed their puppet, their guy, in one of Ivory Coast's most important positions. Everything was now coming together under Prime Minister Alassane Ouattara. Securing complete loyalty was the final remaining step. France also has a plan for that. In 1991, France extended more than political backing to Ouattara in exchange for his obedience and usefulness. He received something far more symbolic from them: a spouse. In that year, Ouattara wed Dominique Claudine Nouvellon, a French woman with strong ties to France's aristocracy. This was more than simply a love affair. The seal was political, an enforceable agreement, a declaration to the world that France's destiny was now inextricably linked to Ouattara's. However, few individuals are aware of this section. This union was not merely a joyous occasion, it was approved. Not even the former French president himself disapproved of it. The wedding was really officiated by Nicolas Sarkozy, who was the mayor of Neuilly-sur-Seine at the time. Yes, the same Sarkozy who would go on to become France's president. What type of African leader then requires the French presidency's consent to be married? It was more than just a wedding. Ouattara's status as France's man in West Africa was formally confirmed. In life as well as at work. It was more than a token gesture for Sarkozy to officiate Ouattara's wedding. It was a sneak peek at what was to come. Because years later, Sarkozy would be instrumental in ensuring that Ouattara would not only serve France, but also become the president of Côte d'Ivoire. But it took time for that power grab to occur. France had a plan, and they followed it exactly. Once Ouattara had secured the prime minister's office, the next objective was obvious: the White House. So what was done by France? To make room for him, they started reshaping the political landscape. Every individual who would pose a threat to Ouattara and who did not support France was deliberately eliminated or discredited one by one. It made no difference whether they were inside or outside the administration. You were dealt with if France thought you posed a threat to their puppet's assent. Then, in 1990, the nation held its first multi-party elections. A turning point. An opportunity for democracy to establish itself. But what took its place? The sole genuine opposition candidate, Laurent Gbagbo, and his wife, Simone Veil, were imprisoned as part of Ouattara's first actions as prime minister. It had nothing to do with law and order. The goal was to eradicate competition. The goal was to ensure that the Ivorian people would never be able to select a leader who was not accepted by France. Because serving the Ivorian people was never Ouattara's actual role as prime minister. Its purpose was to safeguard France's strategic, political, and economic interests. He was in charge of more than simply a government. He was carrying out a foreign plan. Additionally, Paris was pulling the strings. Côte d'Ivoire was in a state of disarray following the death of President Ibrahim, and Alassane Ouattara took the initiative amid the turmoil. Ouattara attempted to take over the presidency against the desires of the late president, who had personally selected Henri Konan Bédié as his legitimate heir. He didn't hold off. He made no consultations. He merely named himself the heir. Naturally, France was right behind him, prepared to fully support their puppet. The Ivorian people, however, they were in Bédié's rear, because they did not consider Ouattara to be their own. He was viewed as alien, culturally as well as politically. Many Ivorians questioned his devotion because of his close ties to France, the former colonial master. Did he really look Ivorian, or only the instrument of France? Fortunately, the voice of the people won out. In 1993, Baidi became interim president and dealt a severe damage to Ouattara's aspirations and France's objectives. However, France was not finished. For a fresh start, they dragged Ouattara back to the international scene. He was named one of the IMF's 3 deputy managing directors in 1994. Yes, a position of prestige, but more significantly, a position of strategy and power. When the time was appropriate, France knew they would give him another call. And they did. France required Ouattara to return to Ivorian politics in 1999. However, there was one issue, a secret that has been subtly concealed in official accounts. Not all of Ouattara is Ivorian. His origins are in Burkina Faso. And even though it might not appear important at first, this information influenced everything. He was disqualified from the 1995 presidential election because of it, and Baidi declared victory once more. Here's the twist though. That Burkinabe origin could possibly account for a current event. Ouattara's meddling in the affairs of Burkina Faso. On behalf of France, not out of fraternity, but out of strategy. And believe me, we will shortly explore that link in greater detail. Everything altered once more just when it appeared that the dust was beginning to settle. The People's Choice, President Henry Konan Bédié, was abruptly deposed in a military coup before the 2000 elections could even be held. The specifics of what transpired behind the scenes are yet unknown. However, the timing, it's too good to pass up. 4 months after Alassane Ouattara left the IMF and went back to Ivory Coast, there was a coup. Is it a coincidence? Perhaps. However, a lot of sources claim that France orchestrated the coup, pulling strings once more to make room for their guy. There was still an issue though, even with Baidi out of the way. Because of his Burkinabe origins, Ouattara was still not allowed to run in the 2000 elections. Who then prevailed? Ouattara had imprisoned Laurent Gbagbo years before. The roles had been reversed. When Gbagbo gained power, France was incensed. Furthermore, France doesn't act out when it's upset. It fights an economic battle. France employed every available weapon to weaken Gbagbo over the course of the following 10 years. They sought out to undermine his presidency, not just to criticize it. To place Ivory Coast in a financial bind, they mobilized Ouattara's supporters within international organizations, including the IMF. The aid was stopped. Loans were stopped. The restructuring of debt was undermined. The objective: make Gbagbo appear like a failure by isolating him. However, economic warfare was not all that France accomplished. The civil war broke out in 2002, barely 2 years into Gbagbo's administration. And once more, it is impossible to overlook the pattern. It is generally accepted that France supported the uprising by providing weapons to Ouattara's supporters in the northern areas. They weren't merely renegade combatants. They were positioned with the intention of causing havoc and dividing the nation. Does that sound familiar? Because history isn't all that this is. They are currently using the exact same playbook. Destabilization, a puppet in the wings, and foreign hands lurking in the shadows in Burkina Faso. How often will Africa fall into the same trap, is the question. The ensuing pandemonium wasn't a coincidence. It was designed. Armed and trained, Ouattara's northern rebels committed willful acts of bloodshed. The outcome? Côte d'Ivoire was split in two by a severe civil war. Ouattara's soldiers took control of the north. The south continued to support Laurent Gbagbo, the democratically elected president. This was the ideal pretext for France to intervene. French troops were sent to support their man in the north under the guise of bringing peace back, but they were actually used as power enforcers rather than peacekeepers. Nevertheless, the conflict continued for almost 10 years. 10 years of carnage, ruin, and bloodshed. A whole generation raised in war. A destroyed economy. A country in ruins. Then, amid the devastation, a presidential election was held in November 2010. The people were worn out, fatigued, and in dire need of anything that even somewhat approximated optimism. At that point, France's last card was played. They said that Alassane Ouattara, the man responsible for the divide and the conflict, was the savior. Ouattara mounted a last offensive with French military assistance and international support. He swept the nation with his army of rebels. They didn't run for office, they prevailed. It wasn't clean though. The country burnt for more than 3 months. The French-backed rebels of Ouattara and Gbagbo's soldiers engaged in fierce combat. Abidjan, the commercial center of Côte d'Ivoire, turned into a battlefield as the death toll increased. Then the most eerie chapter began. A path of misery was left behind as Ouattara's forces marched on the presidential residence. There were thousands of civilians terminated. More than 1,000 people were slaughtered in one town alone. Innocent lives. Deleted. And was this the man France referred to as a savior? A leader who rose to power by mass murder, foreign forces, and civil war. This was not freedom. Under the appearance of democracy, it was a hostile takeover. Now, he is treating Burkina Faso in the same manner. The puppet, the master, the playbook, and the country are all the same. Nevertheless, Laurent Gbagbo did not die easy despite all the carnage. He held his ground along with devoted Ivorian soldiers. When the opposition became too great, what did Ouattara do? He contacted Nicolas Sarkozy, the current president of France, and an old acquaintance. Suddenly, the last act was underway. On April 3, Sarkozy transformed the posh hotel in Abidjan into a command center and directed French elite forces to defend Ouattara inside. Then, Sarkozy dispatched 1,500 French soldiers to Gbagbo's home without any directive from the Ivorian people. They completely destroyed it rather than merely encircling it. The helicopter hits, rockets from tanks. There was only rubble left of the presidential mansion. After Gbagbo was ultimately apprehended, Alassane Ouattara, a puppet of France, was formally crowned king in 2011. Furthermore, Ivorians have never held sole authority over Ivory Coast since that day. Behind the scenes, France has been discreetly and craftily pulling threads. The same pattern is currently being observed in Burkina Faso. Simply consider it. Traoré isn't your average leader. He is the worst nightmare facing France. A fearless, unrepentant anti-imperialist who shared Thomas Sankora's background. He has the audacity to refuse France. Their lies have been exposed by him. The worst part is that he has sparked a revolution in the Sahel that is changing the course of African history. France has lost control due to Traoré and the military leaders of Niger and Mali. No more Niger uranium. Burkina Faso will no longer produce gold. France is enraged. What do they do then? They return to what they are most familiar with, both puppetry and destabilization. The conspiracy to assassinate Traoré. The rebels, the Ivory Coast's safe sanctuary. The playbook is the same as before. Make things chaotic, fund insiders, keep the traitors safe, and use a puppet in place of the revolutionary when the time is appropriate. The world is watching though this time. Africa is observing. And what is France doing is no longer the question. Will Africa allow history to repeat itself? That is the true question. Or will the cycle be broken at last? What better instrument could France use than their own puppet to overthrow Traoré and retake Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast's president? For months, President Traoré has been raising the alarm about Ivory Coast's collaboration with France to destabilize Burkina Faso. However, he was not believed by many. They believed it to be only political bluster. The fact is now indisputable. The traitors who planned Traoré's murder had escaped to Ivory Coast. Why? Because the whole plan originated there. The commands originated there. This is the portion that clarifies things even further. Burkinabe-born President Ouattara is France's devoted enforcer. Indeed, Ouattara has a direct connection to Burkina Faso. There, he has relatives, enduring relationships, networks. Who better to launch the mission than someone with one foot in Burkina Faso and one in Côte d'Ivoire when France approved dealing with Traoré and regaining control? We think that's what occurred. The evidence is starting to support that. A president who is a puppet, a foreign boss, and a clandestine effort to silence one of Africa's remaining anti-imperialist voices. This time, however, the scheme is revealed. Additionally, people are awakening throughout the continent, not only in Burkina Faso. President Ouattara of Ivory Coast, who had the financial and political support of France, not only provided sanctuary to the traitors who were aiming for Burkina Faso, but he also established an operations center for them. Access to Ivorian riches, state protection, and the opportunity to develop a comprehensive strategy to overthrow President Traoré and destabilize the entire country were all granted to them. However, something unexpected occurred. The plan didn't work, and now, under Ouattara's protection, these traitors had immediately returned to their operational base in Abidjan, where they are hiding in plain sight. In addition, Traoré has recently been the target of Ivory Coast. There have been negative articles on Traoré in the Ivorian press. He has been regarded as a dictator. They have accused him of being incompetent in an effort to damage his reputation. He has been charged with committing genocide. You might also be interested in learning that Ivory Coast has previously been a part of coup attempts against Traoré. Reports state that Ouattara has conspired with France to overthrow President Traoré in at least 3 coup attempts in neighboring Burkina Faso. According to reports, Ouattara transferred French money to rebellious soldiers in the Burkina Faso army in order to help overthrow President Traoré. And for this same reason, in front of thousands of people at the Palais des Sports in Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré made a daring warning last year that many initially disregarded, but is now turning out to be tragically accurate. Traoré didn't hold back when speaking. He exposed the real enemy, not just terrorists, but also the imperialists who lurk in the shadows and sow discord. He accused France of seeking to destabilize not only his country, but the entire West African area by stealing from Burkina Faso. We have nothing against the Ivorian people, but we have something against whoever governs Ivory Coast, Traoré stated unequivocally. He revealed a contentious assertion at the time that there is an operating center in Abidjan with French funding and support from Benin and Ivory Coast whose goal is to destabilize Burkina Faso. Many at the time referred to it as paranoia. But now that the traitors have fled directly to Abidjan, take a look. The same city Traoré forewarned about, the specific plan he mentioned, has gradually come to pass. This leads us to the terrible truth. What sort of Africa do we inhabit? In which a nation collaborates with outside powers to demolish another. We frequently declare our desire for unity, but how can we achieve it when treachery has turned into a commodity? The crux of Africa's dilemma is when politicians like Ouattara are prepared to sell off their neighbors in order to gain power. Although our borders may claim sovereignty, our behavior frequently shows that we are weak, fragmented, and subject to manipulation. When will we find out? We will continue to be trapped in the same circle of foreign control, internal turmoil, and stolen futures as long as traitors inside our ranks and Africans like Ouattara are prepared to abandon their people for their own benefit. However, things can change. The day Africans rise, not just in protest, but in principle, change will occur. The day we put patriotism above bribery, unity over treachery, and loyalty above bribes. For only then can Africa start to recover. Leaders like Traoré won't stand alone. Africans are behind him. Tell us what you think in the comments section below. We explore the rich history, culture, and the ongoing struggle for sovereignty in Africa. Join us in this important conversation by subscribing to our channel. By subscribing, you're not just staying informed, You're becoming part of a movement dedicated to reclaiming Africa's rightful place on the global stage. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Let's work together to spread knowledge and inspire change. Thanks for watching.